Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your host, Dr. Mike Brazier.
Today we're going to be reconnecting with he's becoming a frequent guest of the podcast, Frank Baldwin, to share some extra information on a topic that probably flew under the radar, so to speak, for a lot of people over the past couple of years. But I know when you hear about it, you're going to be interested in it. And it relates to a spring conservation season for Canada geese, at least in Manitoba. We're going to get the details of how widely this is available. So, Frank, welcome back to the podcast.
Hey, thanks, Mike.
Yeah, you brought this idea to me as we were preparing for a recent episode where we talked about breeding population survey update, habitat condition update there on the prairies this summer. And you reminded me that this year, 2021, was the first year that y'all had offered a spring Canada goose conservation season, as it's called. That conservation season language is going to be similar to what most hunters will know with regard to the light goose conservation order, the spring conservation order for light geese. And so Canada has found itself in a situation where it's using a spring conservation season to help with some issues it's having around Canada geese. So I guess just give us the rundown on what it is we're dealing with here.
Sure. So I guess the history of the season, 2021 was the first year of the season, but the work towards the season started in about 2014. And really, it's a conservation season, so it's not a hunting season, similar to snow geese and Ross's geese. Canada geese were recently declared overabundant. And over the last few decades, we've been watching this population grow. So we estimate abundance of this population using the Maybe Pop survey, the same one that we use for estimating population size of a variety of duck species. And the population's been growing at an extremely high rate, about 8 to 10% since about the 1990s. And they've been causing a variety of issues, both human safety issues and issues with, agriculture, especially. The migratory bird regulations allow for us to create conservation seasons when a population is designated as overabundant. So means it's defined in the regulations, but it means that the rate of the growth or the size of the population is injurious to environmental, agricultural, or similar interests. And the population really fit the definition well. We're concerned about its rate of growth and how high it could grow if we don't bring it under control. And the best mechanism, in our opinion, to do that was through introducing some increased harvest on it. This is a situation that's common right across many parts of North America, but in Manitoba here, we're in a little bit of a unique situation because we do get we have limited ability to increase the harvest on this population using our fall hunting seasons. And that's mostly due to the swamping of this population by other migrants from across the Arctic and the subarctic.
Yeah, there's a number of things to unpack here. They can get really exciting as we talk about Canada goose biology and, ecology and their molt migration, all that kind of stuff. So let me first make sure I understand a couple of things here. Is this spring conservation season available across all of Canada, or was this just a Manitoba thing?
This is just in Manitoba, and it's only in southern Manitoba. It's okay. The population that was designated as overabundant was the giant Canada goose population, or temperate nesting Canada goose population, whatever you want to call it, in the sort of southern part of Manitoba. We defined the boundaries of the population in the proposal.
Okay. All right. So you answered my second question, which was, which subspecies, if you will, are we talking about? The temperate nesting, the residents, the giant, residents that most people are going to be familiar with. Is it, and what we're talking about now is just southern Manitoba. Is this on the radar in any other provinces in Canada?
I'm not aware of it. I mean, the issue of abundance and growth of Canada geese is on the radar, I'd say, in some other areas, but I'm not aware of anywhere else in Canada that's considering a similar designation.
Okay. Do you have an idea of what's the population size of the resident Canada geese there in southern Manitoba?
Ooh, I'm going back in memory here, but we use the BPOP survey to index it. And so that's only a portion of southern Manitoba that's surveyed. And I off the top of my head, I can't recall the exact size of the population, but it's essentially 3 times the objective that Manitoba set in the 1990s for this population. And the overall estimate is an underestimate because it's only for that portion that we survey anyhow.
Yeah. And it's growing at a pretty high rate, right? 3 times the objective and growing at a pretty high rate right now.
Yeah. So that rate of growth that I mentioned, that 8 to 10% in that neighborhood, that's, population doubling every 7 years or so, I think 7-8 years, something like that. So it's a rate that snow geese grew at, I think in the 90s, in that late 90s, it was, it's a very high rate of growth.
Is this population of Canada geese concentrated around some of the urban areas, or do you see it across the landscape, or is it a little bit of both?
Definitely, it's concentrated. Well, it's right across the landscape, but we do have a number of urban areas that have major issues with Canada geese. But it's an issue right across the southern part of the province. So we have pretty good data on crop damage, compensation, which is paid to farmers. So we have a good idea of where the damage occurring and the time frame. And when we look at narrowing down, that time frame so that we're, looking at spring damage, being caused by this population, so that we're excluding those northern populations that aren't present at that time. And we have, other data sets looking at vehicle collisions with geese, which sounds like it would be an anomaly, but it's not. It's a very common occurrence, and it's, only half of those collisions occur in Winnipeg. So it's not an issue that's confined to one area. And so because it's such a widespread issue, it's not really something that permitting can handle. We do have a permit process for dealing with, localized issues of abundance. But it's such a broad issue that's why we wanted to try to use, hunting to try and control it.
Yeah, and so I want to dig in a little bit, Frank, here on the spring component, or the fact that this is a spring season, and contrast that with the fall seasons, the early fall seasons that we have in the States. And you kind of referenced the reason for this difference just a few moments ago when you kind of alluded to why you have limited success controlling these resident populations through a fall season. But in the States, a lot of areas have early Canada goose seasons. I believe in some places they start as early as September 1, and they're designed to kind of increase the harvest rates on some of those local resident goose populations. But why? Give us some more detail on why that option. Well, I guess 2 things. Do you have an early Canada goose season? And if so, why is it not as effective as what we have here in the States? Give us a bit of an understanding on what's happening there.
Sure. So we know from a variety of states that have even August Canada goose seasons, that August seasons, in a lot of cases, shift harvest from September to August. So they don't necessarily generate a whole lot of additional harvest. They just change the distribution of harvest. And in our case in Manitoba here, August seasons would be a bit of a challenge with our timing of harvest of agricultural harvest, and also they would target some molt migrant Canada geese, possibly a disproportionate amount of the harvest would be molt migrants from other parts of the flyway that are returning back to their natal areas in August and early September. And so what we found was that we were looking for a time period where there would be the most segregation between the population of interest that we're trying to put harvest on and the other populations that cause this sort of swamping effect. And we found that March is the time period where we get a major separation between giant Canada geese from Manitoba that are coming back to nest here, and all of these Arctic, subarctic, and then molt migrant, populations from throughout the flyway.
Okay, and so then you're able to kind of get around that though by focusing on a spring season. When does the spring season occur, and how does that timing specifically align with the different migrations of these groups of birds? Help me understand that.
The first point would be to understand that all of the work throughout the decades to time fall seasons appropriately to protect certain populations or put harvest pressure on other populations, most of that has been done using banding data. So looking at temporal distribution of recoveries of banded birds. The challenging part in the springtime period is the absence of recoveries. So we don't really have a history of band recoveries in any numbers really to look at timing of migration. So that's going back to about 2014 when we were looking at options for trying to control this population. That's when we started to consider how we would determine whether there was any separation in the spring. And so at that time, we started to put together the pieces on a research project to mark representative members of 3 populations that move through Manitoba. So mid-continent cacklers that nest up in the high Arctic or on Baffin Island, and then subarctic Canada geese or southern Hudson Bay Canada geese that nest in northern Manitoba, and then our population of giants down in southern Manitoba. So starting in 2016, we started putting light level geolocators on each population as a means to determine when they were moving through in the springtime because of the absence of that band recovery data. So that's an important piece to just mention off the start. And so we wanted to have, several years of information on that migration chronology during spring because we thought that it could be quite variable based on phenology. And we chose geolocators because they're leg mounted. So they go on plastic tarsal bands and they record light levels and time. They're nowhere near as accurate as something like a GPS collar, but we knew that we could get a long time period out of them, and we were confident that they wouldn't affect the survival or the movement of the birds. So some of the birds throughout the length of the study had 4 years of spring migrations on these devices. So they don't transmit, but you have to get them back, you have to download them, and then you have to use programming to extract location estimates, and the quality of the location estimates vary depending on the time of year, and there's a number of factors and a fairly intensive process to analyze them. But so that work started in 2016. It revealed this time window in March from earliest birds being early March, giants returning back, and then really there being a complete separation of those birds from subarctic Canada geese and cackling geese through until at least the end of March, and actually a bit into April. And so at the time that this proposal was published in 2019, we had back a pretty decent sample of geolocators. I think it was over 90 individuals from 3 populations. Since that time, we've acquired a lot more, both through recaptures from banding operations and also through harvest. So going back to what you said in a previous podcast about the role of hunters, this project this is a project that just would not have been possible without the contributions of hunters. We've got, I think, over 60 geolocators back from hunters that harvested them, that went at their own expense to mail them back to us. Looked after the unit so that it didn't get bumped or compromised in any way. And yeah, they were just an integral part of the project and continue to be so. To be important, we're still getting these things back today. And
so, Frank, if I understand correctly, what you found and what enabled this spring season on your resident giant Canada geese is that they start returning to their natal areas, to southern Manitoba, around the 1st of March, early March, and there's about a month's time before you start seeing migrants from other populations make their way into and through Manitoba. Is that what I'm understanding?
That's correct. Yep. It's actually even a bit longer. We were a bit conservative with the dates when we proposed them because we had a smallish number of cacklers back because cacklers have a very small harvest rate, about 2 to 3%. We didn't get as many of them back. And then we also had some issues with recaptures on Baffin Island that were driven by weather. We deploy these things in such a way that we go back and search for them in the following years of banding and try to capture the birds and download their data. And on Baffin Island, the crew up there ran into weather issues 2 years in a row. So we had a slightly smaller sample of them back. So we're a little bit conservative on the dates. We have a graduate student right now that's working at the University of Manitoba, finishing up her thesis in the next few months here. And she's going to be one chapter of her thesis is proposing sort of the final dates for this season based on the full set of data which we now have, which was a lot more rich than it was in 2019. So that's correct about what you said, though. That's the time window when those birds are coming back, and those other populations that nest, in the Arctic are much further south.
Okay, so 2021 was the first year in which this was offered. How did it go? What were the dates?
March 1st to March 31st is the dates. So quite early. We did luck out a little bit in 2021 with a year of early phenology here. So we had pretty good numbers of Canada geese here in the first week of March. And I'd say a solid 2 to 3 weeks of hunting opportunity. So quite an early migration. I think we did luck out a little bit. And a fair bit of interest. The province had a special spring permit for this season so that we could put together an estimate of hunter participation. And we're just in the process of completing a harvest survey right now. And it looks like somewhere around 1,000 people participated in the season. And that's, of course, residents only because of the border closure. So we're expecting in future years to have a number of non-residents come up and enjoy the season also.
That was going to be one of my questions, if it was going to be open to non-residents in future years once that's possible, and the answer there is yes. What are the daily bag limits? And let me just break it down one question by question. What are the daily bag limits?
Daily bag limit is 8. It's the same as for residents. It's the same as the fall season. For non-residents, it's still 8. So it's more than the fall season for non-residents is 5 here. So it's 8 in the spring. It's not an extremely high bag limit. And the goal is to really understand what sort of harvest pressure we can put on the population and then to, adjust things as we need to. So we've got a well-banded population, or especially well-banded before COVID, not quite as well-banded last year, but some bands did get out last year. And the goal is to use those spring recoveries to try to understand the proportional increase in the harvest rate as a result of the spring season.
Any regulations in place to further minimize the chance of harvesting, let's say, a cackling goose? Do you have that in the regulations? Because cackling goose, between a difference in size between a cackler and a giant, is probably going to be pretty noticeable. Are those types of things written into the regulations, or are you confident enough in those dates and how they avoid the migration of those subarctic populations that you really don't worry about imposing any other species identification restrictions?
The way that it's written in the regs is it's a conservation season for Canada geese, so it doesn't include cackling geese, and we are confident that it will just time-wise miss the migration of cackling geese and subarctic Canada geese, and we'll evaluate that using band recoveries also. So we those are both well banded populations, and as we go through a few more seasons, we'll look at recoveries of those other populations by hunters during that time period.
I don't have any additional questions for you on this. You've provided a great update on it, and I appreciate you recommending this as a topic that would be of interest. I know it certainly will. Canada, there are a lot of folks that listen to the podcast, a lot of folks among our supporters and members that are Canada Goose specialists. And when they hear about an opportunity to participate in a Canada Goose spring conservation order, I'm sure their interest is going to be piqued and they're going to be looking into that. So, hopefully next year you'll see some non-residents participate in that season. Anything else related to that conservation season that you'd like to share?
Well, I just say it's a really unique time to be out on the landscape. It's fairly early, so it's before our migration of snow geese comes through Manitoba. it's an interesting time to be out. Canada geese are very territorial at that time of year, so they're very interested in decoys. Small numbers of decoys on frozen sloughs seem to be quite effective, and it's a neat time of year because you can also do a little ice fishing while hunting Canada geese on like a frozen lake. So it's both as a unique waterfowl hunting experience as I've had.
That's a new twist on cast and blast. Let me just say that. But I guarantee you'll have a lot of people that want to take you up on that. So that's pretty cool. Frank, thank you for taking additional time to share a story about a new development within the waterfowl management community and some additional opportunities for hunters to participate in some of the conservation efforts that are going on across North America right now. And so thanks for that. And yeah, look forward to catching up with you on another topic here later this year.
All right. Thanks a lot, Mike. Appreciate it.
Another special thanks to our guest on today's episode, Frank Baldwin, waterfowl biologist with the Canadian Wildlife Service. Appreciate, as always, his time and expertise. Similarly, we always thank Clay Baird for the great work he does on this podcast and getting these out to you, our listeners, whom we wouldn't be doing this without you. And we thank you for your time and spending with us and for your support, passion, and commitment to wetlands and waterfowl conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.